church being the oldest, most prestigious church in New York. And in 1818, he has his own portrait done by none other than John Trumbull. And as you may know, Trumbull was famous as the painter of the important figures in the American Revolution. But by 1818, he's living in New York, and he's head of something called the American Academy of Fine Arts. That portrait is now in the New York Museum. And this is the portrait of his wife, which was done in 1822, before he was appointed to Trinity Church in Boston. And I looked at that painting, and I looked how calm she is, how composed, how sort of indifferent she is, and I thought she has the perfect expression for the wife of the minister. You know? You have to be tolerant of everybody who comes along, right? Even if you think they are a fool, you greet them pleasantly, you're charming. And she was also the mother of 14 living children. And I thought she has that expression, be calm and carry on. So it's a beautiful painting, and we're really lucky to have a Trumbull in this collection. We move on through 19th century paintings. Here's one by John Inman. It's of his sister-in-law, which I think is an absolutely lovely, exquisite 1830s painting. A friend of mine was here yesterday and read the label, and he said, you have the wrong label up, Carolyn, because it talks about her father as well. And I said, well, you know, we had too many paintings for the space, and one had to go. But the label talked about both of them. And, you know, we're not the National Gallery. We don't have a printer down in the basement and to redo labels in 5 minutes. So if you read that, it's not a mistake. It just tells you about Edmund, and it tells you about the fact that he married into the O'Brien family. And this was his sister-in-law that he painted. This was a portrait that I had a lot of fun with too. And it was probably the only portrait that was well researched in the documents that look here at American University. This portrait was given to the gallery as Uriah P. Levy. Oh, people know who Uriah P. Levy is. Okay, and some volunteer in the 1950s wrote letters to every Jewish historical museum in the United States asking if this was Levy. And every one of them said, no, it doesn't look like him. So it's called an unidentified soldier. She was also good. She approached a naval historian who said that is the uniform of a man, the uniform that was of a naval officer between 1831 and 1840. So we know the date of the picture. He also said the fact that it has one epaulette rather than two means that it is a captain of a ship who was a lieutenant. I thought, oh, maybe I can do with all the digitization move forward. I not only got some military historian who said I can't figure it out, but I discovered there are about 200 people who fit that category. So he remains unidentified, but I thought it was a beautiful portrait. Plus, I thought it would give me an opportunity to recognize Levy, who was the one who saved Monticello at Lahey. Again, a Philadelphia portrait painter. Again, indicative of the Europeans. He's Portuguese, Manuel de Franco, who come to America to find clients. And he immediately gets himself involved with important mid-19th century Philadelphia painters, including Thomas Sully, who painted this charming little portrait, and his son-in-law, John Nye, who you can't see here, who painted her commissioned her portrait. This is again, who's Franny Rundle, I said. Franny Rundle. None. Francis. Thomas Sully. The good news about Thomas Sully is he kept a book which has been published and which is online, in which he records absolutely when he painted something. And he says in his date book that he painted this in the fall of 1828, and he painted it for England. So that told me that she died, more or less about this time. So I read the photo in the newspapers, and there's Francis Rundle. And it is the most sad obituary, as the father and parents clearly talk about the loss of a beautiful, charming, lovely, kind young woman in prime of life, and how unfortunate that is. Her father, George Rundle, a lawyer, clearly knew who's who in Philadelphia and Rhode Island. I commissioned Sully to paint his daughter's portrait posthumously, and the son-in-law novel to paint his own portrait. Now, when you do an exhibition, you can't always shape the show to fit your ideas. So I want you all to turn around right now, stop from going down there, and look at the wall over here. Because this is my wall devoted to George Peter Alexander Healy. And I do a sort of long biographical label on Healy because it really applies to all the paintings that are on this wall. And Healy grew up in Boston. He had a modestly successful studio there in the 1820s, but he wanted to go to Europe and improve his technique. And while he's in Europe, he he attracts the attention of Louis Philippe. And when Louis Philippe becomes king, he commissions Healy to do something like 28 portraits of Europeans, Englishmen, and Americans. And among the Americans, he wants 6 presidential portraits. So Healy, in 1845, comes back to America, and for Louis Philippe, he paints the portrait of George Washington. He paints John Adams. And now Washington is dead by 1845, as is John Adams. So what does he do? He makes a copy after the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait. And the reason this John Adams looks so familiar to you is the fact that the Stuart portrait is in the National Gallery, and you would have seen it there. I hope you will notice that all these portraits, like many of the older ones, have their original frames with them. So Healy then actually makes 2 portraits from life. He goes to the Hermitage to paint Andrew Jackson. He is actually painting Andrew Jackson, finishing the portrait as Jackson dies. He then goes to Boston, where in the summer of 1846, where John Quincy Adams is living, and paints Adams from life. And you can find in the Adams papers, which have been published, the fact that Adams wrote to his wife when he first saw the portrait, "I don't like that painting." And then later he said, "I think it is the best representation of me ever." And that reminds me when the Portrait Gallery was unveiling the portrait of President Clinton, he said, "You know, when you're having your portrait painted, first you're afraid it won't look like you, and then you're afraid it will." So I thought Adams was having very much the same kind of feeling. Now, when you look at the dates, you will see that these paintings are dated somewhat later. And that is because Healy had a business of painting portraits the presidential portraits. He made replicas of his original paintings and continued to make copies of the copies that he had made. So somebody said to me earlier today, oh, I remember seeing, I think it was the Adams in the Pennsylvania Academy. That is probably true. There's probably a replica that he made and is there. Corcoran went to Chicago, where a man named Thomas Bryant had collected portraits, Healy portraits, of which there were many presidential portraits. And he bought 14 presidential portraits in 1879 for the Corcoran collection. He then commissioned a life portrait of Chester Arthur, and when he was president in 1844. Those 15 presidential portraits have been divided between the National Gallery. They got the life portrait of Lincoln and 2 others. The National Portrait Gallery got 9, I think, see if my math is correct. And the AU got the remaining 4, which 3 are on view. So the interesting thing about this collection is when it came into the Corcoran, the curator, a man named William McLeod at the time, said, it is important to have these significant women in our collection free for the public to see. That is, Corcoran had the idea that within the Corcoran collection, he was forming a national portrait gallery. And yes?
Was this before the White House started its own collection?
Yes, 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 yes. And he was interested in, as you'll see, if you go through the whole thing, in important men of his time. Healy also painted portraits of individuals who were wealthy. He was the premier society painter of the time. And this is the wife of, is Mary Martin Anderson Clark, the wife of a man named Meriwether Lewis Clark, obviously the grandson of George Clark, the explorer, and named after Meriwether Lewis's companion in exploration. It was painted, I say in my label that Healy goes back and forth between the Atlantic, between Europe and America, as if the Concord existed. And in 1855, he came to Chicago, stayed there till 1869, goes to Rome while Paris is involved in the Franco-Prussian War, and then settles in Paris in late 1873. These people are on their honeymoon in Europe. And what you do to celebrate your honeymoon in Europe, you get your portrait done. And it's really quite a beautiful female portrait. Unfortunately, the marriage was not as beautiful as the painting. And it turns out that Meriwether Lewis Clark, who gave Churchill Downs, where the Kentucky Derby is still held, lost a lot of money in 1893 in the depression of that year, committed suicide in 1899. But it says in the newspaper, his wife is in Paris with the 2 children. So they had long lost the pleasant days when this particular portrait was done. I included this little double portrait that Healy did. It is Mrs. Volk and her daughter, and Leonard Volk was a sculptor who grew up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, moves to Chicago in 1855. He and Healy become close friends. They both do a portrait of Lincoln. He makes the Lincoln life mask in 1860, and Healy does the life portrait of Lincoln just after his election, but before his inauguration. So this is a portrait of friendship. I don't know whether Volk commissioned Healy or whether Healy did this out of friendship. When I said that Healy did a kind of great man, this is the Senator Justin Morel, who he painted in 1884. And Morel was important not only as a founder of the Republican Party, but also as the man who created the land grants, which underlie the land grant colleges in America. This would include Michigan, Wisconsin, University of Maryland, University of Delaware, Virginia Tech,
Illinois,
to name only a few. And so I think, oh, land grant colleges, I don't know much about land grant colleges. And the only thing that I learned in life, there's always good news and bad news, because they got the money for the land grant colleges by selling land that had been taken from indigenous people. So it's, good news, bad news kind of story about Justin Morel. What amused me as I went to newspapers when this was exhibited at the Corcoran in 1884, at the opening was Healy, Morel, and Corcoran. And the next day the critic wrote, "This is not Healy's best portrait. It looks like the individual as he was 15 years ago, and it might have been a better painting if it had been painted 15 years ago." And I thought that took a lot of nerve to anger three of the most important Washington people at the time. So I have one other question for you. Every exhibition has a orphan, what I call an orphan wall. And down here, I have three paintings that are not Healy's, but they're very much in the style of Healy. One of them is of Commander Matthew Fontaine Maury by a man named Louis Duveneck. And he was a Frenchman who came to America in the 1860s. He settles in Richmond, where he makes a living painting Confederate generals. He comes to Washington in about 1869, and he advertises in the Washington Star, and he says, "I can paint portraits from life or from photographs." And I realized that by the time this painting is done in the 1870s, Maury is dead. So it's obviously a painting from a photograph, and you can find photographs of Maury looking very much like this, and then with the painting embellished with, his scientific publications, etc. And what startles me is I've always thought paintings and photographs were very flat, very unlifelike, and if I had known better, I would have said this was from a life sitting. On the far side of him is a man named George Washington Parke Custis. Who is he? What do you know about him?
the grandson of Dr. Washington.
That is correct. Very good. He is the adopted grandson of, well, thank you very much. I get my signals to hold this up. He's the grandson of Martha Washington. He is adopted by Washington. He marries Robert E. Lee's daughter. He's the owner, well, this gives too much a clue. What's the most important thing about him?
Arlington.
Right. The land that he inherited from his father's side of the family, 1,200 acres, is now Arlington National Cemetery. And so while it's not totally a wonderful well-known Jewish portrait, I thought that he's an important individual, and people should be reminded of where Arlington Cemetery came from. And then on the far side of him, you must know and look, is a wonderful portrait of Constantine Bermudi. And we have here today the author of the book on Bermudi, Barbara Landon, who wrote a wonderful story of all the that he did for the cabin. And it's a charming painting. it may have been a study for something in the Capitol, but it clearly was never used. And it's of Samuel Morse, and it's probably done from a photograph rather than like, but it's beautifully painted. Now, having said that, you can then come back and finish off the rest of your tour. And I have two things to say. One of them is you go farther down the gallery here, you will find if you read the label that the people are no longer nationally known figures. You know, the whole impetus that Corcoran had disappears, and the collection becomes much more focused on the artist. Who was the important? These were both important artists and both important people, but who is the artist? The subject of itself is less significant. And a perfect example is the 1920 painting, the 1876 painting of Major Carr that was acquired by the Corcoran in 1920, just after Duveneck dies. And Carr is, you know, a military figure, not particularly well known, but Duveneck is still seen as one of the premier late 19th century painters. Next to it is Eugen Weisz, a portrait of his parents, who were both artists, early loving. An important painting, it was shown in the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. Next to that is a portrait by Julian Alden Weir. It's of a model. You'll find increasingly models become the subject of artists. And then I want to fit in, so just look at what's down at the end there. You have a work by George Biddle that he did in Tahiti. You have another work. So it's a whole different sort of subject matter. And then I have my final, so you can all walk around, my final group over here, which happened by accident. It really did, and it came to me as I was laying out the exhibition. This is my Corcoran history corner. And what you see in the first thing is Charles Dunn, the grandson of the Charles Dunn, which you saw earlier on. This is done by Edmund Tarbell. It was commissioned by the trustees. Tarbell had the Boston painter had just come to be director of the Corcoran School. And I loved writing the label for this, because I said, and I learned myself, everything you love about Washington had the hands of this Charles Dunn on it. He was instrumental in the founding of Rockland Park. He was instrumental in founding the National Zoo. He drained, I like to say the marshes, so I don't like to say drained the swamp, in order to have the Jefferson and Lincoln memorials. He gave the British Embassy these land to build their embassy on Mass Avenue, establishing Embassy Row. He lived here just south of Word Circle. His house was called Westover. Any of you know the townhouses there now that are called Westover? That is why. He owned the land in the apartment next to it, all the way down to Cathedral Avenue. Obviously, you know Clover Archibald Park. Thank you very much. He was a major promoter of the city of Washington. He also was on the Board of Trustees.
Most important.
From 1890 to 1921.
Also of the American University Board of Trustees.
I'm sorry. I didn't give the full university. When I said the university, I just assumed you would know that it was the American University. The next portrait is of the director of the Corcoran Museum. He was a man who, after he left Episcopal High School as a high school graduate, came to work for the Corcoran as a clerk in 1892. In 1904, he became assistant director of the museum In 1950, he became director of the museum, and stayed at the Corcoran until he retired in 1942. That is a 50-year career at these institutions. His portrait was done by a man named John Johansson, who was the premier society painter in the 1940s. Next to it is a teacher at the school, and what is so fun about these teachers and people invested in the school is I've asked a lot of Corcoran graduates if they know the name, and they don't. So this is revival in Corcoran history. A man named Eugen Weisz. He's Hungarian. He was working early on, worked for the Italians in an Italian artist studio, then got a job with the Buffalo Bill traveling circus in Europe, and I don't know whether he came on his own to America or with the Buffalo Bill entourage when he came back to the States, but anyway, he's here by around 1915. He joins the Army for World War I, ends up being stationed in Washington, and takes some classes at the Corcoran School of Art, and ends up as a teacher. And I have this feeling that he was a fun teacher. Next to him, Richard Lahey, again, a director of the school, Richard Behrman, director of the schools. Next to him, again, a Washington figure, Marshall Langren. If you've been around long enough, you might know him. Met somebody who knew him, and he came to New York. He was very involved with the American abstract artists in New York, which probably accounts for the nature of his portrait. Next to him is Mrs. Dean Atchison, Alice Atchison, who took umpteen classes at the Corcoran Gallery of Art. She was painted by a man named Alexander James, who was William James's son, and as I begin to label, I said he's probably the first Harvard legacy that was turned down. Because he didn't go to Harvard. He became a painter, they were good friends, and I know lots of people who were here at the opening, and people who have been since, who told me about Mrs. Atchison and said, that's not a good portrait of her. She was a very gentle, loving person, not as austere and commanding as she is there. She was also one of the founders of the Women's Committee for the Corcoran. So again, a major thing. The next two paintings, the little boy and the little girl, are by a student at the Corcoran. The woman who grew up in the sort of Roanoke-Lynchburg area was a bank clerk, gave up that about 1930, took classes. Paul Richards wrote an article about her after she died in 1975-ish, and said she took something like 400 hours of painting, 300 hours of sculpture. She considered the time of the Corcoran the happiest moment of her life, and when she died, she left them in 1976 about $176,000, which rescued them from their financial crisis. And then the final one is Edgar Nye, who painted here in Washington. There's a caricature of him by a student. So this is a whole little mini, by accident, Corcoran history that you can read. Do you have questions? Yes, Anne?
What happened to the object part? I don't understand.
You know, I asked Sarah Cash, and she said they didn't keep it. Now, she obviously had them when she wrote her great book on American painting, all of which went to the National Gallery. But they were, and then I asked another person who had done research, and she said there are artist files that are now at the Portrait Gallery being interleaved, but they didn't deal specifically with the individual paintings. Yes, Joan.
The Sawyer, is that part of the story?
Is what?
The Sawyer,
I'm sorry.
the Rockefeller, Mrs. Sawyer, part of the woman's part.
Yeah, that's a kind of orphan wall as well. And it was a late portrait. I knew who it was, and I thought it brought the closest Sawyer. I thought it brought up an interesting question. when somebody is working with a model, and the model's name is known, is it really a figure study or is it a portrait? It's, you know, it's a fine kind of line there. So I thought it was a lovely piece. It was given to the Corcoran by the sitter. Sawyer often did ballet models, used ballet dancers as models because his wife was a dancer. It's a miscellaneous walk across the history.
It's around the corner.
It's around the corner. You have to get up and go around the corner. Yes.
Yeah. I just have a question historically. So Corcoran was collecting these portraits, especially of the presidents. And then the National Portrait Gallery opened much later.
Correct.
Why didn't it go to the National Portrait Gallery? Which is all, I guess it was always much Smithsonian Portrait Gallery, not Corcoran.
They divided the 15 portraits between the National Gallery, that's the first choice. The Portrait Gallery took.
But that's now, that was this.
Why didn't it go in the beginning? Because it belonged to the Corcoran. It belonged to the portrait.
But that's because it was the National Portrait Gallery.
There was no National Portrait Gallery until 1963.
Right.
You know, until the Smithsonian was given a building, there had never been a place to realize that idea. And so what's amazing, if I may say so, about the Portrait Gallery, is that they got so many pieces that were still out somewhere in the market or still belong to private collectors. But the Corcoran was not about to give up its collection. And some of the portraits that were given by Mellon to the National Gallery were given with the understanding they would go to a portrait gallery should they ever be formed. The National Gallery was formed in 1941, but they never left the National Gallery. The Portrait Gallery did a lot of things from American history, from the equivalent of Sam to begin its embryonic collection. Yeah, but from dealers and Other questions?
Could I ask you to say a few words about my favorite painting, the Haida Cooper children?
Oh, yes, you could. And I skipped over there. Let me tell you which one it is. It is right on the other side of the speaker here. See them? These three children. And you always learn something. And the Haida Cooper paintings had the donor identified the three children that were in the portrait. Edward Jr., Gertrude, and the other sister whose name I think was Elizabeth. And it was given by Gertrude's daughter. And so I had the names, and then I looked at the Haida Cooper family, and they are a big-time family in Meadville, Pennsylvania. I don't know who the artist is. It's a beautiful mid-19th century children's portrait. So I'm putting together the catalog, and the designer of the catalog says, I'm so excited about this show because there are two people in it. I live in Glover Park, given by Mr. Glover, and the Haida Cooper Street is 2 blocks over from me. The Haida Cooper Street. It never dawned on me that this Pennsylvania family would have a Washington, Washington connection. In fact, I couldn't understand quite why it had been given to Corcoran instead of, say, the Pittsburgh Museum. And that's why, because the eldest Haida Cooper brother, and the designer sent me the link to an archived manuscript, was president of the Southern Railroad and had a large house on 18th Street back in. So that's where I came. So I learned, all this time, starting from ground zero, I learned a lot about Washington history, about individuals, and you never stop learning, just like I never stopped learning about Mrs. Atchison. She was going to look like that, about the Haida Cooper children. Okay, another question, Jack?
No, any other questions? So I hope you'll be around for a little bit afterwards.
Sure.
I just want us to thank Carolyn Carr for her amazing scholarship. And her equally amazing memory, I think you'll